Summer of 1883. Dust Haven burned dry under a sky pale as salt. The earth cracked open, grass turned to dust, and the cattle stood still in the heat, bones and shadows. The Bennett house sat in the middle of it all, quiet as a fading prayer. Zaria Bennett pulled open the barn door, her hands rough with sweat and grit. She looked out toward the fields where the sunset bled red across the horizon, a light that made the world look aflame. 3 years of drought. 3 years of holding on. Now, the bank had sent the final notice. 60 days to deliver 400 cattle to Copper Springs, or the ranch would be seized. Her father, Elijah Bennett, sat on the porch, his leg bound in a splint, a cane resting by his chair. He had once been strong as iron, but that winter, a horse went down in a storm and broke his bone clean through. Now all he could do was watch his daughter carry the weight of their land alone. "Have you counted the herd?" he asked. 363, Zaria answered, her voice flat as dry earth. "If we push hard, we can still make it." "No one's going to follow a girl, Zaria." "Then they'll follow a man." He lifted his eyes to her. In that look were things neither had ever said: fear, belief, and something close to surrender. After a moment, he nodded slowly, like a man who knew he could no longer stop a changing wind. That night, Zaria sat alone in her small room. The oil lamp flickered in the breeze leaking through the doorframe. On the table lay a chipped mirror, an old pair of shears, and a faded photograph of her mother, a gentle-eyed woman with long, proud hair. Zaria touched her own hair, thick, black, and soft, once her mother's pride, now her burden. It made people look at her and see weakness, softness, everything she could no longer afford to be. She picked up the shears. Steel flashed in the lamplight. One deep breath, then a clean, sharp snip. The sound was final, clear, like breaking a bond. Strands of hair fell to the floor, dark and shining, each one a farewell. To her youth, to her safety, to the name Zaria Bennett itself. When she lifted her head again, the reflection in the mirror was no longer the girl from Dust Haven. Her hair was cropped close to her neck. Her face looked sharper. Her eyes, steady, deep, and dry as a well. She stood, shedding the brown dress for her father's old shirt and worn leather trousers. She pulled on his boots. In the mirror now stood Zane Bennett, lean, unshaken, his shoulders squared. Outside, the night wind swept through scorched fields, carrying the scent of ash. She stepped onto the porch where her father still sat. Moonlight caught on her short hair, silver like fresh forged steel. Elijah Bennett looked at her for a long time, then let out a low, proud chuckle. "Your mother would be scared half to death," he said softly, "but proud just the same." Zaria sat beside him, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. "Don't know if I can do this," she said, "but I have to try. Trying's more than most ever do." He placed his hand over hers. "They won't see a black girl out there. They'll see a Bennett." She squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses and the warmth of him. Then, almost to herself, she whispered, "Tomorrow I'll hire the men. They don't need to know who Zaria is. They just need to know Zane Bennett pays fair." Before going inside, she looked once more across the fields. Moonlight poured over the cracked earth, making it shine like silver. For a moment, she thought she saw her mother's shape standing there, smiling. "I'll save this land," she murmured to the wind, "even if I have to become someone else." When the door closed, Her cut hair still lay on the floor, black, coiled, gleaming under the lamplight, a witness to the promise she had made. Outside, the night wind of Dust Haven shifted, and the journey of the woman who cut her hair to start again had begun. Morning in Dust Haven came pale as ash, sunlight falling thin over the dirt road of Stillwater Creek. Dust rose beneath the hooves of horses, drifting past the saloon and the blacksmith's shop. The clang of hammer on iron mixed with the rough laughter of men drinking under the awning. Through that chorus of noise, Zane Bennett, the name Zaria now carried, led her horse down the street, hat pulled low, her father's old leather jacket making her look both familiar and foreign. Heads turned. Folks didn't know that the young man, with warm brown skin and eyes dark as wells, was in truth the only black woman for miles around. To them, she was just a stranger, lean, quiet, carrying the air of someone who'd walked too long through loss. At the saloon doors, Zane paused, drew in a breath. The wooden sign above creaked in the wind, the paint on saloon flaking off. From inside came the sound of an old banjo, tangled with the smell of whiskey and smoke. She pushed through the doors. No hesitation, no bowing of the head. Silence fell for half a second, heavy as hot iron. A few men turned. Eyes slid over her face and stopped on her skin. One man gave a low whistle. Another smirked. "Well now," someone rasped. "Half-blood thinks he can drink with us?" Zane said nothing. She crossed the room, boots steady on the warped floorboards, and stopped at the bar. Her voice came out low, firm, and dry as gravel. "I'm hiring hands for a cattle drive. 60 days to Copper Springs. $40 a man. Food and horses on me." The bartender, a heavy man with a stained shirt and rumpled vest, froze mid-wipe and glanced up at her. "40's fair pay. But who's doing the hiring?" "Bennett Ranch," she said. The air shifted. Laughter broke out from a corner table. A tall, narrow man with a scar down his cheek leaned back in his chair, grinning. "Bennett Ranch?" he barked. "That place still standin'? Thought the old man's girl sold off the herd and ran." Zane turned, her gaze cutting through him, cold and steady. "The old man's girl died last winter." The laughter died. The scarred man's mouth twitched, but he said nothing more. The silence that followed was brittle, and hers. The door swung open again. Light spilled in, catching on a pair of polished black boots. The man who entered stood tall, shoulders broad beneath a clean white shirt that didn't belong in a place like this. His hair was dark chestnut, his face sun-browned, and his eyes, sharp blue, calm as judgment. Hank Mercer. Zane recognized him at once. The only grandson of Banker Mercer, the man who owned the Bennett's debt. To her, that name meant chains. "Heard the Bennett Ranch is taking one last gamble," Hank said easily, his voice just loud enough for the room. "My grandfather wants to be sure the shipment's legitimate." "Your grandfather wants to make sure I fail," Zane replied. Her tone wasn't raised, but it cut through the noise like a clean blade. For a moment, he looked almost amused. He hadn't expected defiance. In the lamplight, he saw something rare in the young man before him. Not fear, not arrogance, but a quiet kind of strength. The kind that comes from carrying too much alone. "You've got a sharp tongue," he said. "I'll ride with your crew, as the bank's fair observer." "Fair?" Zane echoed, the faintest smile at one corner of her mouth. "Fine. Just stay out of my way." "I'll keep my distance," he said, taking a seat and pouring himself a drink. "Good. Keep it that way." Her words were dry as desert wind. A few men chuckled, not mockery this time, but respect. Zane turned back to the room, repeated her offer. $40 was more than most saw in a season. One by one, hesitation gave way to nods. When she stepped outside, 12 men had signed on. Hank rose too, following her to the door. The late sun cut across her cheek, turning the dust on her skin to gold. He meant to speak, but she was already in the saddle, reins tight in her hand. 3 days from now, she said over her shoulder, sunrise at the Bennett gate. 3 days, he replied. I'll be there. The wind stirred, lifting a swirl of dust between them. He watched her ride away until she was only a blur against the fading light. He didn't know why he kept looking, only that, in the dry wind of Dust Haven, he'd just met the first soul who wasn't afraid of him. Dawn in Dust Haven carried no blush of pink like other places. Here the sun rose from cracked horizons, its light white and sharp as a blade. The herd stirred, heavy, restless, breathing dust into the air. 400 cattle, 15 men, and one young man named Zane Bennett at the lead. The sound of whips cut through the wind. The ball of cattle stretched across the plains like a hymn to endurance. Zane rode a dark stallion named Dusty, shoulders squared, eyes scanning the land, rope gripped firm in her hand. She didn't shout like other trail bosses. Her voice came low and steady. 2 miles left, water west. That was all, short, certain, yet every man obeyed. Hank Mercer rode the right flank, hat tilted low. He had come to observe, but the truth was simpler. He expected failure. No banker in his right mind would trust a ranch's last chance to a green hand. But by midday, Hank began to realize Zane Bennett wasn't like anyone he'd known. The kid barely spoke, yet every command seemed to ripple through the herd like instinct. When a calf strayed, Zane gave a soft whistle, and somehow the animal turned back. When the sun climbed high, she never faltered, sweat tracing her neck, eyes fixed ahead as if they could will the dust to part. Luther, the oldest hand, chuckled once. You ever get tired, Bennett? Zane didn't look up. Only when I stop. The men laughed. But Hank didn't. There was no pride in that answer. Only truth. By dusk, the light dimmed to copper. The drive halted by a shallow creek, a thread of water glinting faintly beneath the moon. Saddles hit the ground, fires sparked, and the smell of beans and sweat mingled with leather, the scent of the West itself, heavy, real, and enduring. Hank sat apart, pretending to write in his ledger. His eyes, though, never strayed far. Zane knelt by the creek, washing her hands. Moonlight caught on her skin, on the scars along her wrists, the kind made by rope, by labor, by survival. Not clumsy scars, but the map of someone who had earned every breath. A breeze passed. Zane lifted her head. Her gaze met his, a still, unwavering moment. No words, just quiet, the kind that hums between two people from worlds that should never touch. Her eyes were calm, unflinching, but deep within them Hank saw something that hollowed him. Determination, weariness, and a loneliness so pure it hurt. He turned away, scribbling nonsense into the page. Drive steady, leader. Strange. Night thickened. The moon climbed higher. The steady rhythm of the herd's breathing rose and fell beyond the campfire like the heartbeat of the earth. Hank leaned back against his saddle, listening to the murmurs of the men. Zane stayed awake, walking the line, checking ropes, checking water, as if she believed that stopping, even for a moment, might let the whole world collapse. Luther wandered over, offering his flask. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I've worked under more bosses than I can count. But this one, Bennett, he's different. You see it?" Hank followed his gaze to where Zane knelt tightening a cinch. "I see it." "What kind of different?" "Maybe the kind that knows everyone's life depends on them." Luther smiled, took a swig, and walked away. Hank stayed, watching, not out of suspicion anymore, but something else, something softer, something he didn't yet have a name for. When the fire burned low, Zane sat alone. She pulled off her gloves, staring at her rough, sun-darkened hands. In the water's faint reflection, her face was half shadow, half light. No longer the Zaria she once was, not quite the Zane she pretended to be. Only a person caught between two selves, clinging to one vow: save the land, no matter the cost. Across the stream, Hank still hadn't slept. He saw her small frame bent in the silver glow, the short hair glinting like iron beneath the moon. And something stirred in him. A quiet tenderness, threaded with respect, and the first flicker, faint, uncertain, of something dangerously close to love. The western sky could change as fast as a man's heart. At dawn, the sun still burned white and merciless, but by noon the wind began to roar, sweeping dust high into the air, turning the heavens the color of cold iron. The cattle grew restless, tails flicking, eyes wild with unease. Zane Bennett, or rather Zaria, lifted her head. She felt that strange, hollow quiet only those born to the land could sense. A storm was coming. "Camp down," she shouted. "Drive the herd into the canyon. Pshoo, move." A few men hesitated. "Still looks sunny," one muttered. But Hank Mercer, watching from the right flank, caught her eyes. And he knew. Without a word, he spurred his horse forward and bellowed, "You heard the boss! Move it!" The wind rose like a beast. Minutes later, the sky tore open. Thunder split the air like the lash of a god's whip. Dust turned to blindness. The herd bawled in panic, and Zaria charged through the chaos, rope in hand, voice cutting through the storm. "Keep the calves in the middle. Hold the line. Don't break." Then came the rain. Not drops, but buckets. It poured down, drenching her to the bone, plastering her cropped hair to her brow. Her boots sank into mud as she fought to keep the herd tight. Hank was beside her now, helping tie canvas windbreaks at the canyon mouth. The gusts were so fierce they nearly tore the fabric, and them, away. Zaria slipped, sliding down a slope of wet clay. In an instant, Hank lunged, catching her arm, pulling hard. They fell together, breath ragged, faces inches apart. The storm howled around them. Rain streamed between them like a veil. Her eyes were dark, not from fear, but exhaustion. Hank's grip tightened on her shoulders as he shouted above the wind, "Leave it, Bennett. The herd can take the hit." "No," she said, voice small but steady as stone. "Not one dies." Then she tore free, stumbling back into the fray. Rope burned her palms raw, blood mixing with mud. Hank stared for a heartbeat. The slight, narrow-shouldered boy he'd once thought too frail was out there commanding a storm itself. Lightning split the sky. For a breathless instant, it illuminated her face. Rain streaming down bronze skin, eyes bright like molten steel. Strength and beauty, wild and unyielding. They worked side by side, shouting through wind and water, hands raw and shaking. Every time their fingers brushed, skin against skin, cold and trembling, something wordless passed between them. There was no time to name it, only the drive to keep every living thing alive. By the time the storm limped west, the world had turned gray and still. The two of them collapsed against the wet ground, shoulders touching, lungs heaving. Rain still fell in thin threads, clinging to Zaria's lashes like tears she refused to shed. They didn't speak. Around them, the air softened, the wind fell quiet. Hank turned his head and saw the rope marks bleeding on her wrist. He reached, meaning to say, "Let me help," but she only gave a slight nod, not pulling away, not hiding, just acceptance. That silent nod said everything words couldn't. The fragile bridge between two lives that should never have crossed. Morning broke clean and gold. Sunlight spilled over the soaked earth, steam rising warm from the mud. The herd stood scattered across the canyon floor, shaken but alive. A few cuts, a few limps, but not one lost. The men looked around in disbelief. Luther, wiping his brow, murmured, "Ain't seen anyone keep a herd through a storm like that." Zaria simply wiped her hands, voice hoarse. "Cattle just need someone to believe they can make it." As she turned away, Hank remained still. He watched her, small, worn, and somehow might against the whole horizon. The sun caught on her short hair, turning the droplets there to silver sparks. In that moment, Hank knew what he'd seen wasn't just skill. It was a kind of power he'd never known, not in any man nor any woman. When she passed by him, heading toward the creek, he spoke quietly, voice rough with something he couldn't name. "You did good, Bennett." Zaria gave a faint nod, eyes on the ground. "We all did." Simple words. But to Hank, they rang like a vow. And from that moment on, he knew. His faith had begun to change direction. Rumors traveled faster than wind across the prairie. 3 days after the storm, talk spread through every station along the trail. Stories about a black man driving a herd through the West. Each retelling twisted a little more. Some said he was a runaway debtor. Others swore he was mad, and one claimed to have seen him praying to the sky before the storm broke. When the herd stopped at the horseshoe station, the air felt heavier. Zaria could sense it, in the way a few of the drovers no longer greeted her in the morning, and how conversations fell quiet when she passed. That night, under the flicker of campfire, the whispers sharpened. "He's only half-blood, you know. Half's enough to bring trouble. This drive's cursed anyway." Zaria heard every word, though she didn't turn. She sat alone, mending reins, her hands steady even as her shoulders tightened. The firelight carved her face in shades of bronze and weariness. Not anger, just the kind of strength that has nowhere left to go but forward. Hank Mercer sat nearby, back against a wagon wheel, cigarette glowing faint in his fingers. He'd heard the talk all day, and he knew, if someone didn't step up tonight, the drive would fall apart before the halfway mark. He rose and walked toward the circle of men. His voice came low, but carried through the night. "Anyone who doubts their trail boss can leave at sunrise. But remember, whoever stays rides for a man who keeps his word." The murmurs stopped. Hank's gaze swept across them, calm, cutting. "Bennett drove 400 head through a storm and didn't lose one. You think another man could do that? Then by all means, go find him. But don't sit here croaking like crows." Silence. Only the pop of firewood. Then Luther, the oldest hand, cleared his throat. I'll stay, he said, 'cause I saw him save my hide and the herd too. That's all I need. One by one, heads nodded. No one spoke again. Hank tossed his cigarette into the fire and turned back toward Zaria. She looked up when he came near. The light caught his face, the blue of his eyes gone metallic in the flame. You didn't have to do that, she said softly. I just said what I believe. You believe in me, Mercer? I believe in what I see. For the first time, Zaria didn't look away. She handed him a tin cup of coffee, steam curling between them. When he took it, their fingers brushed, a small touch, but both froze. Her skin was warm and rough from work. His was cool, smooth. It lasted only a heartbeat, but felt longer, like the night itself paused to listen. They both let go, eyes shifting down, yet the quiet between them had changed. The fire threw their shadows on the canvas wall, two shapes sitting close, slightly leaning toward each other, as if sharing a secret neither could name. Zaria poured another cup. The talk won't stop, she murmured. I've learned to live with it. Hank sipped his coffee, watching her through the shifting light. I haven't learned to watch people be wrong. She smiled, tired but real. You'll have to. Out here, fairness always shows up last. He didn't answer. He only watched the flames dance, thinking of the boy everyone whispered about, and realizing that what he'd once called curiosity was turning into something deeper, quieter, and harder to ignore. Zaria stood, brushing her hands on her trousers. Get some sleep, Mercer. Long road ahead. And you? I'll watch the herd. Somebody always has to. He watched her walk toward the edge of camp, the moon painting silver over her short hair and the damp earth. The night wind carried the scent of fading rain. Zaria stood still among the cattle, her dark eyes catching the faraway glow of firelight. She didn't know Hank was still watching, that behind her, something unseen had shifted. Somewhere between the wind and the fire, trust had begun to spark, not with words, but with a single, quiet touch beneath the endless western sky. The road through the Silverback Range was the hardest stretch of the trail. Sheer cliffs loomed on both sides, and the narrow pass barely allowed one cow to squeeze through at a time. The sky hung low, heavy with storm clouds, the wind carrying the damp scent of coming rain. Zaria rode at the front, eyes fixed on the thin gap ahead where the road disappeared into mist. "Watch your footing," she called back, her voice rough from dust and wind. Hank followed close behind, his gaze never leaving her figure. She hadn't slept properly in days, only rode, counted, planned every mile and every drop of water. He didn't say it, but a quiet ache had grown inside him, part admiration, part worry. Thunder cracked without warning. Zaria's horse spooked, rearing up. She pulled hard on the reins, but the animal rose again. In the next instant, she lost balance and fell, tumbling down the rocky slope. "Zane!" Hank shouted, leaping from his saddle. He caught her just before her body struck the jagged stones. Zaria gasped, winded, pain flashing through her chest. Her shirt was torn, her breath shallow. Hank knelt beside her, hands searching for wounds, pushing back the wet fabric to check for bleeding, and froze when his fingers touched the strip of white bandage wrapped tight around her torso. His eyes stopped there. Shock, realization, disbelief. The rain began to fall, slow and heavy, drumming against their shoulders, but neither moved. He looked at her, voice breaking. "Zaria, Bennett." She closed her eyes, rain tracing her cheek like tears. Her hand clutched her shirt. "If you tell them," she whispered, "it's over. They'll walk. The herd's gone. My father's land. Gone with it." Hank said nothing. He looked at the woman before him, soaked, trembling, but unbowed. Raindrops clung to her lashes like glass beads. He didn't see a liar. He saw someone holding up a dying world with her bare hands. "I only see," he said slowly, voice deep under the rain, "someone doing what most men wouldn't dare." Zaria opened her eyes. Their gaze locked, long, raw, like a wound that didn't need bandages. The rain thickened. They took shelter in a shallow cave, lighting a small fire with the few dry sticks from her saddlebag. The flame flickered weakly, barely enough to warm their hands. Zaria sat with her knees drawn up, face caught in the orange glow. For the first time in weeks, she said nothing about cattle or trails. Hank removed his hat, wet hair falling across his forehead. His voice was low. "Why you? Why not let someone else take it on?" "Because no one else could," she said. "I was born in a place where people only see skin, not souls. If I don't fight for this land, they'll be right, that we were never meant to stand tall." He was silent, then murmured, "Now I see." "See what?" "That you don't need saving. You just need someone to believe." Zaria looked at him for a long time. The cold edge in his eyes was gone, replaced by something quieter, something that reached her in a way words couldn't. The rain outside softened to a steady hum. She reached out, hesitant, her hand trembling, not asking for help, but as if to ask, "Can I stop pretending now?" Hank took her hand, fingers closing around hers, firm and sure. No more words. They sat there a long while. No more Zane, no more supervisor. Only Zaria and Hank, two worn souls who'd finally found a still point in a world of storms. The fire burned low, leaving only a red glow against stone. Zaria leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "For the first time, I'm not afraid." His reply came soft, almost lost beneath the rain. "You're not alone anymore." Outside, the rain kept falling, but in that small hollow of rock and firelight, a quiet peace took root. They didn't need promises. They didn't need desperate touches. Just warmth. Two wounds learning where to heal. By dawn, they would rise and ride again, playing their parts as before. But that night, between rain and flame, between disguise and truth, they found something no storm could take, a faith born from honesty. The gray sky slowly lifted after the night's rain. Water dripped from the cliffs above, each drop falling in a steady rhythm, the quiet heartbeat of dawn. In that pale light, Zaria opened her eyes. Warmth lingered beside her. Hank Mercer sat not far away, his back against the rock wall, eyes half closed. When she stirred, he looked up, calm, gentle, a gaze stripped of distance and pretense. Something new had taken root there, fragile but certain. Zaria shifted, pulling the blanket closer around her shoulders. "Don't let the others see," she murmured, her voice rough from a long night. Hank nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Then I'll only look when we're alone." She didn't answer, just lowered her head and tightened the bandage across her chest. He reached as if to help, then stopped. knowing some battles she had to fight on her own. Zaria rose, shaking the rain from her short hair, and stepped outside. The sun crept over the ridge, golden and soft as honey. Mist clung low across the valley, where the herd stood scattered, grazing on wet grass. Their breath rose in thin white clouds against the morning light. Zaria moved among them, touching their hides, counting, watching. Hank followed from a distance, seeing her as she truly was, calm, steady, unbroken. There was no awkwardness, no regret in her movements. What had passed between them was not weakness, but something like sunrise, quiet, unstoppable once begun. When he joined her by the campfire, she was tending the small flames to dry her clothes. Sunlight caught her damp hair, gilding her bronze cheeks with gold. He said nothing, just picked up a coil of rope and began to roll it tight beside her. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he replied. "I want to." She smiled faintly, but her eyes darted toward the distant tents where the others were waking. One man shaded his eyes, glancing their way. Zaria drew back her hand. "Keep your distance, Hank." He paused, then nodded. "I understand." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of fire and the whisper of wind slipping through stone. Hank sat on a nearby rock, pretending to clean his gun. Just another watchman on the trail. Zaria glanced once, then turned back to her work. By the time they left the canyon, the sun was high. The earth was soft. The horses moved slow, wheels leaving deep tracks in the mud. The herd was calm, but the air around the men had changed, watchful, curious. Voices rose in short whispers that died when Zaria rode by. Luther came up beside Hank, lowering his voice. "That Bennett kid. Where was he last night?" "Watching the herd," Hank said without looking at him. Luther nodded, eyes narrowing. "He's different today, softer, like somebody finally taught him how to smile." Hank smirked, saying nothing. "Don't forget, he's the reason this herd's still breathing. Smile or not, doesn't matter." Luther chuckled and rode off. Hank exhaled slowly, turning his gaze forward. Zaria was at the front again, her faded shirt clinging to her back, her small frame steady as a fence post. She looked over her shoulder once, and their eyes met. Neither smiled, neither spoke, only a single nod, quiet and sure. A promise. Silence meant safety. By noon, they stopped by a valley creek. The men ate quick and rested. Hank stood watch on a small ridge, sunlight glinting on his damp hair. Zaria approached, setting a canteen beside him. "You should sleep a while." "I'm fine. What about you?" "I'm fine too." Her tone was even, but her words carried warmth he could feel. Hank took the canteen, tipping it slightly toward her in thanks, his eyes resting on her hand just long enough for her to notice. As the afternoon wore on, they rode again. No one spoke of the night, or the truth that had been uncovered, yet in the fleeting glances between them, when their horses moved side by side, when breath met breath in the wind, something wordless held shape, solid, real. When sunset bled over the hills, Hank guided his horse closer and said quietly, "Whatever they doubt, I'll stay." Zaria didn't turn, her voice low as wind over grass. "That's enough." They rode on. The sun dipped. Their shadows stretched long across the red dirt road. Two figures moving forward through silence, bound by something both fragile and certain, the peace of morning and all that went unsaid. The last days of the trail brought the taste of salt to the wind. The closer they came to Copper Springs, the drier the earth grew, the soil red and cracked, like sunburned skin or dried blood beneath the sun. The men were worn thin, but no one dared to slow down. 10 days more, and the herd would reach its end. Zaria still rode at the front, her narrow shoulders casting a long shadow across the ground. No one knew her heart was beating harder than ever. In the silence of the nights, she heard whispers, not the idle talk of men, but fragments of something real, something dangerous. One night, Luther came to Hank's tent, his face set like stone. "Mercer," he said quietly, "there's something you ought to know." Hank lowered his rifle, met his eyes. "It's Travis." He saw Bennett rewrapping a bandage around his chest. Luther hesitated. "He wrote a letter, sent it back to Stillwater. Folks at Mercer Bank'll know before we hit Copper Springs." Hank froze. His heart fell like a stone cut loose from rope. He didn't need to ask more. One letter could undo everything. "You told Bennett?" Luther shook his head. Didn't have the stomach for it. When he left, Hank sat motionless, hands clenched. Outside, the wind howled through the camp, lifting sparks from dying embers. He knew exactly what would happen once that letter reached town. A black woman disguised as a man, deceiving the bank. A single phrase like that could destroy her name, her dream, her father's land. By dawn, he found her saddling her horse, eyes fixed on the horizon as if she had already guessed. "There's trouble," he said. "I know." "You know?" "I saw Travis slip away last night. I don't need to guess." Her voice was calm, too calm. It hurt him to hear it. Hank stepped forward, hand light on her shoulder. "I can fix this. I'll tell my grandfather it's a lie, a trick. I can make it disappear." Zaria gave a faint smile, not bitter, not grateful, just weary. "Hank, we can't outrun judgment. We can only ride straight through it." He was silent. "You once told me I didn't need saving, remember?" she said softly. "Then don't save me. Just ride beside me." Hank's jaw tightened. Then he nodded once. "All right. Then I'll ride beside you. To the end." That day, they moved in silence. The wind burned hot and dry, painting streaks of light across the scorched land. Zaria rode tall at the head, but he could see the weight in her back, the strain in the way she sat her horse. She knew this trail wasn't just the end of the drive. It was where every truth would find her. Night fell heavy. The camp was still as a graveyard. No one spoke. Some were too tired, others afraid of what they might learn. Hank sat by the fire, eyes on her tent. Her shadow moved inside, writing slow and steady. When she stepped out, he asked, "What are you writing?" "A message," she said simply. "In case I don't make it home before he hears." "You think they'll treat you that badly?" She shrugged. "Badly? No, they'll laugh. They'll say my name over dinner and call it a story worth telling. I've learned to live with worse." The wind carried the smell of ash and salt. Hank threw another log into the fire, its light rippling across their faces. "You don't deserve that." "It's not about deserve," she said quietly. "It's just what is." He looked at her, throat tight. There was something in her tone, not bitterness, but the quiet fatigue of someone who had carried too much for too long. He wanted to pull her close, but he knew even kindness could be a cage. Instead, he handed her a tin cup of coffee. She took it, their fingers brushing. One more fleeting, wordless promise. "Get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow we cross the Dust River. If we reach Copper Springs, the rumors will die. And if we don't, then I'll die as myself, not as the name they gave me." The fire cracked softly between them. Neither spoke again. Outside, the wind began to rise, sweeping dust across the plains. A storm without thunder, only the heavy silence of fate drawing near. That morning, sunlight spilled like silver across the roaring Dust River. After weeks on the trail, the herd finally reached the border between Dust Haven and Copper Springs. A wide, muddy stretch of water swollen by rain, snarling between slabs of rock. Zaria sat astride her horse, eyes fixed on the churning current. The river wasn't just a barrier. It was a boundary between lies and truth, between fear and the choice to keep living. She drew a long breath, tasting the damp wind heavy with earth and change. Luther rode up beside her. "Water's higher than I remember, boss. Wait too long, it'll rise more." Zaria nodded slightly, gaze unmoving. "We cross today. The longer we wait, the stronger the fear." Hank pulled up alongside her. "Let me take the lead." She shook her head. "No. If I'm afraid, the others will be too." He wanted to argue, but stopped. He knew no one could stand in for her now. Zaria nudged her horse forward. The animal stepped into the torrent, water lapping at its knees, then its chest. The current fought her with every stride, foaming white against hooves and stone. Each step felt like the ground might vanish beneath her, yet she kept going. At midstream, she stopped. Breath short, rainwater and river spray streaked her face. She turned. All the men were watching from the bank, waiting for her to lead them across. For weeks, they had followed Zane Bennett. But the moment had come when pretense could no longer carry them. She knew she could not cross this river wearing someone else's name. Zaria turned her horse to face them, voice rising clear and sure above the rush of water. "If you need to hear the truth before you follow," all sound stilled. Only the river and her heartbeat remained. "Then listen." She pulled off her hat and unwrapped the bandage from her chest, one turn at a time. Her short, wet hair clung to her forehead, glistening under the light. "I am Zaria Bennett, daughter of Thomas Bennett of Dust Haven." A wave of silence swept across the bank. Faces shifted, shock, confusion, anger. Zaria sat straight, reins tight in her hands. "If knowing I'm a woman makes you afraid, you can turn back. I'll hold no one here. But this herd goes to Copper Springs, not for pride, but survival." Luther was the first to move. He stroked his beard, then let out a quiet chuckle. "Boss is still boss," he said. "Man or woman, still the one feeding me 3 meals a day." A few men laughed, soft and uncertain, but the edge of tension broke. 2 younger hands, Pike and Samuel, exchanged glances, then spurred their horses away. "I don't ride behind no woman," one muttered. Zaria didn't flinch. "The road home's behind you. Go on." They rode off, their hoofbeats fading into the wind. No one else moved. Luther turned back to her, calm as ever. 13 left, boss. That's enough." Zaria faced the far shore again. Hank hadn't moved. His gaze held hers. Not pity, not shock, only quiet faith. She gave him the faintest smile. "Then let's go." Together they urged their horses forward. Water exploded in sprays of white, cold, and wild. Each surge fought to drag them down, but slowly, steadily, they pushed through. When her horse's hooves struck solid ground on the far bank, Zaria looked back. The river roared behind them, swallowing their footprints like the past itself. The men stood catching their breath, drenched and laughing. Hank took the reins from her hands, his voice rough but soft. "You know, if I were them, I'd have stayed too. No one walks away from a leader brave enough to go first." Zaria met his eyes, drops falling from her chin, sunlight flashing in her deep brown gaze. "I only did what I had to." "No," he said quietly. "You did what most never will." She said nothing, only turned toward the herd as they drank from the riverbank. They had crossed, and so had she. That night, they camped by the water. Luther built a fire, his voice low and steady. "I thought this drive was about money," he said. "Now I see it's about something else. A reminder that courage doesn't carry a gender." No one replied. Zaria sat wrapped in a blanket, eyes on the flames dancing before her. In their reflection, her face glowed not with secrecy but with peace, the calm light of someone who had crossed the river and at last become herself. News travels faster than hooves. Before the Bennett herd even reached Copper Springs, word had already outrun them. Stories of a black woman disguised as a trail boss cutting through the West. At every way station along the route, men whispered. Some mocked. Some admired. But most waited, eager to see how this Western farce would end. By noon that day, Copper Springs shimmered under the heat. The streets were packed, townsfolk, traders, bankers, and strangers drawn by rumor. Footsteps and murmurs buzzed like bees. Zaria rode tall in the saddle, her shoulders still dusted with the trail, eyes fixed on the end of Main Street, where the sign for Mercer Bank gleamed in the sun. Hank rode close beside her, silent, knowing what awaited them. Ahead, a crowd gathered in front of the market square. At its center stood Wallace Mercer, Hank's grandfather, erect in a gray suit, his silver cane tapping the ground like a gavel. His face bore no smile, only the cold gleam of judgment. "Well now," Wallace said loudly as the herd halted, "a miracle indeed. A young lady who led 600 miles of cattle and deceived my entire bank." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Zaria drew a slow breath, tightening her grip on the reins. She was done hiding, done apologizing. "I didn't deceive anyone," she said, her voice steady but clear. "I simply did what you once said couldn't be done." Wallace's lip curled. "Couldn't and shouldn't. A woman like you," he never finished. Hank stepped forward, pulling off his gloves. His voice cut through the noise like a clean blade. "That's enough." The murmuring stopped. All eyes turned toward him. Hank stood beside her, his coat still marked with dust, his eyes unshaken. "If this is fraud," he said evenly, "then I'm her first accomplice." The crowd fell silent. Wallace's cane struck the dirt sharply. "Do you know what you're saying, boy?" "I do," Hank replied. "She didn't fool anyone. She led this drive, while I, Hank Mercer, her so-called supervisor, did nothing but watch and learn what decency looks like." The words rang out, not loud, but solid, echoing through the quiet like a hammer. A warm gust swept the square, swirling gold dust around the horses' hooves. Hank turned to the onlookers, voice low but certain. You see that herd behind us? Every last head made it here alive. She did that. Not me. Not any of you. And if anyone deserves pay or respect, it's Zaria Bennett. Luther stepped from the line of riders, nodding once. Boss is boss, he said, gravel in his voice. I rode with her 60 days. Ain't met a soul who knew right from wrong the way she does. Applause broke out. Scattered at first, then stronger. More joined in until the sound rolled like thunder through the street. Not wild, not jeering. Slow, heavy, real. Zaria sat still, her hand trembling slightly on the reins. The sunlight glinted off the tears on her cheek, turning them to silver. She wasn't crying for victory, but for the simple fact that she no longer had to hide. Wallace's expression hardened. He looked around, suddenly smaller before the crowd's quiet defiance. His voice came out rough. You're destroying yourself, Hank. No, Hank said, eyes never leaving Zaria. I'm choosing. Zaria lowered her head, silent, letting the tears fall freely now. Hank stepped closer, taking the reins from her hand, light as a whisper, a gesture no one else would see. The crowd began to break apart. Someone cheered, someone laughed. Children ran beside the cattle. Luther clapped shoulders. And for the first time, Copper Springs felt less like a place of judgment and more like a place reborn. By late afternoon, when the papers were signed and the last head counted, Zaria stood on the steps of the bank, looking toward the distant fields. Her father was there, frail but upright, helped forward by kind hands. His eyes glistened as he whispered, "You did it, my girl." Zaria smiled softly. "No, Papa, we did." Behind her, Hank leaned against a post, his gaze warm as the evening sun. In the golden dust of Copper Springs, as the light spread across the street and the air filled with the scent of rain and leather, they both understood. Courage had its price, but sometimes that price was its own reward. 3 days after the herd was sold, Copper Springs woke to a strange quiet. The noise of the market, the cheering that had filled the town when the Bennett drive arrived, all of it had faded like last night's wind. On the wooden porch of the bank office, Zaria stood alone, holding a folded sheet of paper, the final receipt of payment. White paper, black ink, a red seal, the simplest thing in the world, yet heavy as a lifetime. She smiled softly. Not the smile of victory, but of someone who could finally breathe after crossing a long, dark storm. "Zaria." Hank's voice came from behind her. He stepped closer, hat low, shirt rumpled, hands still stained with dust and sun. He no longer looked like a banker's grandson or the man sent to oversee her. He looked like someone who had chosen the land instead of comfort. "It's done?" he asked. She nodded, handing him the paper. "The Bennett Ranch is free of debt." He looked at it, then at her. "And you're free of pretending." "No," she said, eyes brightening. "Now I'm just Zaria, a woman with a home, a herd, and a season of rain coming." He laughed quietly, that warm, worn laugh that seemed to reach her deeper than words. "Sounds like a lifetime plan." "And you?" she asked. "I lost my inheritance," he said simply. "Grandfather made sure of it." Zaria lowered her head. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." He touched her hand gently. "I've never felt lighter. I had everything but a reason. Now I've found one. With you." She looked up. His eyes held no promise, no grand vow. only the calm certainty of earth after rain. When they returned to Dust Haven, autumn was beginning. The once burnt fields now shimmered green from the first rains of the season. The Bennett Ranch rose on the hill, fences mended, the new roof glinting pale under the sun, and a thin thread of chimney smoke curling into the sky. Her father, Elijah Bennett, sat in his old chair on the porch. When he saw them, he leaned on his cane, pushing himself to stand. "My girl," he said, his voice breaking, "you kept your father's land." Zaria ran to him, wrapping her arms around his frail frame. The warmth of that thin, trembling body told her everything. That every wound, every long night, every insult had been worth it, just for this moment. Hank stood quietly a few steps behind, hat in hand, his expression soft. Elijah turned toward him and took a slow step forward. "You know," he said, "I used to worry no man would be brave enough to walk beside her. Guess I was wrong." Hank smiled, shaking his hand. "I only followed someone who already knew the way." The three of them sat together on the porch as the wind carried the smell of wet grass and the low sound of cattle from the fields. The sunset washed the sky in amber, gentle and forgiving, like a blanket over old scars. When the sun finally slipped behind the ridge, Zaria walked out into the yard. She knelt, pressing her palm to the damp soil. Tiny blades of new grass poked through, tender and bright. A beginning. Hank came beside her, kneeling too. "You saved the land," he said. "No," she answered softly. "We did." She laid her hand over his, then on the ground again. "This land isn't just a place to live. It's proof, that courage doesn't wait for permission." Hank didn't reply, he only looked at her. The gold of the dying sun caught in his blue eyes. In that light, there was no need for words. Their love was no longer a secret, no longer a stolen promise whispered in the storm. It was simple, honest, like breath, like soil, like life returning after drought. That night, the warm glow of lamplight spilled from the cabin windows. Inside, soft laughter mingled with the crackle of the fire. Zaria looked around. The small kitchen, the worn table, her father resting by the hearth, and Hank splitting wood outside the door. It was enough. It was right. She whispered, to the earth, to the wind, to her mother's memory. We kept this land, and what it means in our hearts. Outside, the night deepened. The wind carried the damp scent of the new season. On the land they had saved, everything old had begun to grow again. Time moved across the plains like wind, quiet, but never still. Dust Haven had changed. The fields once cracked and barren now shimmered with grass. Streams wound between the hills, and the cattle grazed slowly beneath the amber glow of dusk. The air carried the sweet scent of new hay, the soft ring of cowbells drifting over the valley, the rhythm of a land once scarred, now breathing again. On the hill overlooking that valley stood a wooden house, sturdy, simple, and warm. The sign at its gate read, Bennett and Mercer Ranch. Below the carved letters, 2 handprints pressed into the wood had faded with years of sun and wind, yet still held the shape of laughter. Zaria stepped out onto the porch, her hand resting on the rail. Her hair, streaked now with silver, was tied in a loose knot. The sun caught the bronze of her skin, turning it honey gold beneath the falling light. Down the slope, Hank was mending a fence, his movements slower now, shoulders broader, his hair threaded with the same gray dust that lingered at the edges of a day. When he looked up and met her eyes, he smiled. The same easy smile from years ago, the one he wore when he said, "Now I have something worth doing with you." He climbed the steps, his hands still rough and speckled with sawdust. Zaria handed him a cloth. "You still won't take a break," she said softly, half scolding. "Can't," Hank replied, wiping his brow. "If I stop too long, I might forget what it feels like to live for something." She smiled, her gaze warm as sunlight through the window. "We live to keep this land, remember? And to keep each other," he said quietly, taking her hand. They sat together on the long wooden bench. Across the valley, the sun poured gold over the hills. A few sparrows swept by, landing on the porch rail, their wings whispering against the wind. After a while, Hank asked, half in jest, half in thought, "Ever regret cutting your hair that night?" Zaria turned toward him, eyes glinting with the soft red of sunset. She smiled, the calm, sure smile of someone who had walked through fire and rain and still chosen kindness. "If I hadn't," she said, "I never would have met you." The wind rose gently, carrying the scent of dry grass and pine. They sat without speaking, fingers interlaced, a silent thank you for everything that had come before. Below them, the pastures stretched wide and bright. New fences lined the fields, each post set straight by their hands. The cattle moved slow beneath the dying sun. Everything bore their mark, of work, of faith, of love strong enough to survive the hard years. Inside the house hung a single framed photograph, a young woman with short hair, in a loose shirt, astride a horse in the middle of a storm. Beside her, a man in a wide-brimmed hat looked toward her through the wind. Beneath the photo, in Hank's hand, was written, "For the night she cut her hair, and everything that began after." As the sun slipped behind the ridge, Zaria leaned her head against Hank's shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. The last light of day spilled over the porch, over the fields, over the quiet lines at the corners of their eyes. Not sad, not weary, but full. Below, the stream murmured, the cattle called softly, and the wind drifted through the willows. Together they formed a kind of song, the story of two people who once stood against the world just to live honestly, and stayed. Eyes closed, Zaria whispered, "Strange. I used to think freedom meant leaving. Now I know it's sometimes the courage to stay." Hank's voice came low beside her ear, "And to build something no one thought could exist." The wind carried the scent of grass and wood smoke. The gold light faded into blue, leaving two silhouettes on the porch, still hand in hand. There, on the land once called dead, they had built more than a ranch. They had built proof. Proof that faith, freedom, and love born from trust could bring life back to even the driest ground. The final image, dusk settling over Bennett and Mercer Ranch, the hills of Dust Haven bathed in peace for the first time in years. If this story reminded you of love, of home, or of something once lost but never forgotten, leave a comment below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to keep these Wild West love stories alive, gentle tales for hearts that never stopped believing.